What if the real secret to Viking survival was not the sword, not the longship, and not even the shield wall, but the quiet green life buried under frost? We remember the Vikings as raiders, traders, and warriors with salt in their beards and iron in their hands, yet the truth is stranger and in some ways more impressive. A people who lived through long northern winters could not survive on courage alone. They needed fields that forgave cold, gardens that yielded in poor light, and plants that could either endure the freeze or wait out the season in storage until hunger came knocking. Archaeology and museum evidence show that Viking-age households depended on vegetables, legumes, herbs, and hardy gathered plants far more than popular imagination likes to admit. Their world was not only built by axes and oars, it was also built by cabbage leaves, roots in damp earth, onions hanging from rafters, and seeds kept for the next spring. And that is what makes these 12 forgotten Viking vegetables so fascinating. Survive winter in the Viking sense did not always mean a plant stayed green in the snow. Sometimes it meant it stood in the cold and sweetened after frost. Sometimes it meant it could be dug from half-frozen soil. Sometimes it meant it dried well, stored well, or held enough nourishment to carry a family through the darkest months of the year. Written evidence from the Viking period is sparse, but archaeobotanical finds from settlements, towns, military sites, and household waste have opened a window into what people really grew and used between about AD 775 and 1050. That window reveals a tougher, greener, and more practical Viking world than the one most people imagine. And here is the first twist in this story. Winter did not begin when the snow fell. For the Vikings, winter began the moment they failed to prepare for it. First comes cabbage, and cabbage deserves more respect than almost any other Old World survivor. Archaeobotanical evidence from Viking-age southern Scandinavia includes cabbage, and the wider food lists compiled by museums place it clearly among known garden crops. In a northern world, cabbage was almost perfect. It tolerated cold, could be eaten fresh when young, and, when mature, became a heavy, solid promise against hunger. The outer leaves could feed people or animals, the heart could go into soups and stews, and with proper handling, it could remain useful long after more delicate plants were gone. Cabbage is not glamorous, but winter survival rarely is. If a Viking household saw rows of dense heads in late autumn, they were not just looking at vegetables, they were looking at insurance. Close beside it stands kale, the tougher cousin that feels almost designed for a colder age. The Archaeobotanical Review notes that species of kale or mustard appear in late Iron Age pollen spectra, and that matters because kale is one of the great cold weather plants of the north. Frost does not always destroy it. Sometimes it improves it, softening the bite and making the leaf sweeter. In a hard climate, that changes everything. A plant that can stand outside after other crops fail is not just food. It is morale. It is proof that the garden is not dead yet. When we picture Viking winter food, we tend to imagine dried fish and smoked meat, but the reality may also have included dark green leaves pulled from a frozen plot, chopped into the pot while wind hammered the walls outside. Listen carefully, because this is where the Viking garden stops looking primitive and starts looking intelligent. Onions were more than flavor. They were status, medicine, symbolism, and survival wrapped in layers. The Archaeobotanical Review describes onion as highly appreciated for its strong taste, and even notes that onions may have helped inhibit bacteria in food. More striking still, the same paper points to the word lauker appearing in runic inscriptions, suggesting onion mattered not only in diet but symbolically as well. Museum food lists place onions firmly in the Viking garden. That makes sense. Onions are efficient, portable, and storable. They turn bland porridge, broth, or stew into something alive. They hang well, travel well, and ask for very little once cured. A people who had to think in seasons would have treasured a crop that could leave the ground in autumn and still answer hunger in the dead of winter. Garlic belongs in the same cold weather story, even if it hides from archaeology more easily than its importance might suggest. The museum list of Viking-age foods names garlic among garden produce, and the Archaeobotanical Review notes that garlic, like onion, is often underrepresented in the record because alliums do not preserve well in many contexts. That is a reminder that absence in the soil is not always absence in life. Garlic stores beautifully, punches above its weight in flavor, and offers the same kind of compact usefulness that practical societies adore. A little garlic can rescue a simple meal, and simple meals are the backbone of winter. The Viking world did not need culinary extravagance, it needed ingredients that lasted, worked, and earned their place. Garlic did. Then come leeks, and leeks may be the most quietly northern plant on this list. The museum evidence names leeks among Viking garden crops, and anyone who has grown them in a cool climate understands why. They are patient. They stand in poor weather. They can remain in the ground late into the season, and in milder stretches even through winter. Unlike softer greens, they do not collapse at the first insult from the sky. Their flavor is gentler than onion but deeper than grass or herb, exactly the kind of backbone a soup needs when the pantry is down to the honest basics. Imagine a pot on a Viking hearth, some stored grain, a scrap of meat or fish, a handful of peas, and sliced leek. Not luxury, not feast. Just survival made fragrant. This is the part modern people often miss. The Viking kitchen was not poor because it was simple. It was simple because simplicity survives. Carrots also appear in the archaeobotanical evidence, and while Viking-age carrots were not the bright supermarket version we know today, their value would have been obvious. Root crops are winter-minded crops. They bury their treasure underground, out of wind and partly out of danger. Carrots can be left in cool soil, lifted late, or stored in cellars and clamps. They are dense, dependable, and more forgiving than tender garden foods. In a climate where fresh abundance vanishes quickly, roots matter because they buy time. A carrot is a small thing in summer. In the lean months, it is a delay against starvation. The Viking lesson is almost brutal in its clarity. If a plant can hide from winter in the earth, it has already learned half the trick of survival. Parsnip is even more revealing because it shows how connected the Viking world really was. The Archaeobotanical Review says parsnip was not detected in southern Scandinavian Viking Age samples, but it does appear in Viking Age urban deposits along the Baltic shores. That matters because the Viking world was never sealed off. Goods, ideas, seeds, and tastes moved along trade routes just as silver and stories did. Parsnip is a dream crop for cold country. Frost sweetens it. The root can remain in the ground deep into the cold season. It stores well, cooks into soft richness, and carries a quiet energy that fits winter eating perfectly. So even when parsnip does not appear everywhere, its presence in the broader Viking urban sphere tells us something important. Northern people were actively selecting plants that matched harsh conditions and long hunger gaps. And now the story turns from the garden bed to the edge of the wild, where survival becomes even more interesting. Angelica may be one of the most haunting plants in the Viking world. It appears in the Archaeobotanical Review, which says it was traditionally considered a Viking-age garden plant, notes that it is mentioned in the Old Norse kings' sagas from Iceland, and allows for a real possibility that it was cultivated during the Viking Age. The museum food list also includes angelica among gathered foods and herbs. This is the kind of plant that blurs the line between food, medicine, and identity. Its stems, leaves, and roots were useful. It could grow in harsh northern environments where fussier crops would fail. It belongs to that older world where people did not separate nourishment from remedy as neatly as we do. To grow or gather angelica was to trust a plant that understood cold mountains, wet edges, and rough weather. In another age, it might have been dismissed as rustic. In the Viking Age, rustic could mean life-saving. Broad beans, listed in the archaeobotanical evidence as Vitia faba, reveal another winter strategy. Not every survival crop had to stay fresh. Some only had to dry well and endure. Beans are protein, bulk, and security. They could be grown in the short northern season, harvested, dried, and stored. In winter stew, that matters enormously. A society does not cross the hungry months on flavor alone. It needs density, and beans provide it. The same review notes beans were present at several incorporated sites and had been cultivated throughout the Viking Age. That kind of persistence suggests trust. Year after year, households came back to crops that gave something substantial in return. Not every hero survives by fighting. Some survive by waiting in a sack until the snow comes. Peas belong to the same logic, but perhaps even more intimately to the pot. The Archaeobotanical Review identifies peas at multiple sites and suggests pulses were important enough that later Christian fasting practices may have encouraged even greater cultivation. The museum list also includes peas among ordinary garden produce. Peas dry well, cook into thickness, and can transform thin broth into a meal with body. For a Viking household, that would have been priceless. Dried peas are not romantic, but they are reliable, and reliability is the true currency of cold climates. Anyone trying to understand northern history should pay attention to the foods that can sit silently through a whole season and still feed you when the light fails. Peas are one of those foods. If you want to understand why some civilizations endure, do not ask what they celebrated in summer, ask what waited for them in February. Chicory is one of the most overlooked names in the Viking plant record, and that is exactly why it matters. The Archaeobotanical Review lists chicory and suggests it was probably cultivated for its green parts, while also noting the roots are useful. That combination is powerful. A plant that offers leaf and root is doing double duty in a world where wasted space could become a winter problem. Chicory is bitter, and bitterness often signals that we are dealing with an older food culture, one not built around softness or sugar, but around resilience and usefulness. It can be cut for greens and still offer something below ground. That is of Viking quality if there ever was one, useful above, useful below, and valuable even when the season turns hard. Then there is bishop's weed, also known to many gardeners today as ground elder, and perhaps no plant on this list better captures the phrase forgotten vegetable. In the Archaeobotanical Review, it appears among Viking Age plant finds, and the paper notes it had already been found in Iron Age settlements in Scandinavia. Today, many people think of it as a nuisance, but older food cultures often saw possibility where modern ones see weeds. Young leaves can be eaten, and the plant comes back with stubborn force year after year. That persistence matters. Vikings lived close enough to the land to recognize that a useful plant does not have to be elegant. It only has to arrive early, return reliably, and offer nourishment when choices are narrowing. Sometimes the difference between abundance and hunger is simply the wisdom to eat what keeps showing up. Celery, too, appears in the Viking Age archaeobotanical evidence, though likely valued more for seeds and herb use than for the thick modern stalks we think of today. That does not make it less important. It makes it more realistic. Older food systems used every angle they could: leaves for flavor, seeds for seasoning, roots where possible, and preserving methods to stretch the harvest. The review even notes celery was probably cultivated as a herb and that its seeds were utilized. In other words, Viking people were not just filling their bellies. They were building flavor systems that made repetitive winter food more bearable. That matters more than it sounds. A winter diet can break the spirit if every meal tastes dead. Celery and similar hardy kitchen plants helped keep food from becoming merely fuel. And finally, we come to mustard, greens, or perhaps more accurately, the mustard and kale world hinted at in late Iron Age pollen evidence. This last entry is important because it reminds us that archaeology does not always hand us a modern menu with perfect labels. Sometimes it gives traces, spectra, seeds, and probabilities. But even probabilities can tell a powerful story. Mustard family plants are famous for toughness, speed, and usefulness. They can be eaten young, used as greens, or saved for seed and flavor. In marginal conditions, that flexibility becomes a kind of quiet genius. A Viking family did not need every crop to be luxurious. It needed enough crops to be adaptable. Mustard belongs to that ancient category of plants that do not complain much, do not ask for pampering, and still give something back when cold weather closes in. So what do these 12 vegetables really tell us? They tell us the Viking world was far more domestic, observant, and ecologically intelligent than the stereotype of endless rating suggests. Archaeological evidence from settlements and towns shows a mixed food system built from crops, gathered plants, pulses, herbs, and roots. Museum summaries of Viking food underline the same truth. Everyday people relied on what came from field, garden, forest, and shore. Winter survival was not a last-minute act of toughness. It was a year-round discipline of choosing the right species, reading the land properly, storing what lasted, and respecting plants that modern abundance taught us to overlook. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of all. The Vikings did not survive winter because they were fearless. They survived because they were practical. They honored plants that modern people ignore. They understood roots, leaves, bulbs, and seeds as tools of endurance. They knew that one green shoot in cold ground could mean the difference between a household that endured and a household that broke. The forgotten vegetables of the Viking world are not really forgotten, because they were useless. They were forgotten because comfort made their virtues harder to see. But under pressure, their value becomes obvious again. Toughness, storage, patience, flavor, return. So the next time someone talks about Viking survival, do not picture only the axe, the sail, or the fur cloak. Picture a winter garden half asleep under frost. Picture onions braided in the rafters, beans drying in the dark, leeks standing stubborn in frozen soil, and angelica rising where harsher winds blow. Picture a family surviving not by myth alone, but by knowledge. Because long before modern supply chains, before supermarkets, before imported abundance, the North was kept alive by people who understood a hard truth. The strongest kingdom is the one that can still feed itself when the world turns cold. And that may be the most dramatic Viking secret of all. Empires look powerful in summer, but winter reveals what is real. There is something almost humbling about that. We live in an age that mistakes convenience for strength. Yet the Viking record suggests the opposite. Strength often looks like redundancy. One crop fails, another survives. One patch rots, another stores. One meal is thin, but a bulb, a root, a sack of peas, and a strip of dried fish turn it into tomorrow. That is not just agriculture, that is strategy. The same culture that planned voyages across dangerous seas also planned for hunger with equal seriousness. Their gardens were small fortresses. Their seed choices were decisions about risk. Their winter vegetables were not side dishes. They were a survival technology written in green. And once you see that, the Viking world changes. The longhouse is no longer only a hall of warriors. It becomes a place where someone sorted onions, checked the bean sacks, trimmed the last leeks, and watched the weather with the anxiety of anyone who knew exactly how thin the line was between enough and not enough. That is real history, not louder than battle, but deeper, and in many ways far more impressive.